The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of the weathered timber buildings of Dorado, Kansas, sending up a cloud of dust that coated everything in its path. And Zelda Danvers pressed her palm against the window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She had traveled for 3 weeks from Philadelphia, each mile taking her further from the life she had known and closer to a future she dreaded with every fiber of her being. The year was 1873, and the West was still as wild as the stories claimed, though those tales had always seemed like distant fantasies when she read them in the safety of her father's library. Now, standing on the precipice of her new reality, those stories felt more like warnings she should have heeded. The driver opened the door with a creak that seemed to echo through the dusty street, and Zelda gathered her skirts, stepping down onto the wooden sidewalk. The heat struck her immediately, a dry, relentless wave that made her wool traveling dress feel like a prison. She had expected harshness in this frontier town, had steeled herself for rough men and rougher conditions, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer foreignness of it all. The buildings were simple structures, some barely more than planks nailed together, and the street was packed dirt that turned to mud with every rain. Men in dusty clothes and wide-brimmed hats moved about their business, some casting curious glances her way, others ignoring her completely. She was here to marry Thomas Whitmore, a man she had never met but whose letters had convinced her father that he was a suitable match for a woman of 22, who had lost her marriage prospects after a scandal that was not even of her own making. Her sister had run away with a married man, and somehow the stain of that transgression had spread to Zelda as well, poisoning the water of Philadelphia society until no respectable family would consider her for their sons. Thomas Whitmore had promised stability, a home, and a fresh start in his letters, but he had not promised kindness. She did not expect it either. Men in her experience were creatures of ambition and pride, capable of civility but rarely genuine tenderness. A tall figure detached itself from the shadows of the building beside her, and she turned to find a man approaching with an easy, confident stride. He was not dressed like the other cowboys she had seen. His clothes were cleaner, his bearing more assured, though he wore the same wide-brimmed hat that seemed standard issue in this place. As he drew closer, she noticed his eyes first, a startling shade of blue-gray that reminded her of the sky before a storm, and then his face, weathered but handsome in a way that spoke of time spent outdoors and a life lived without pretense. "Miss Danvers." His voice was deep and measured, carrying a warmth she had not anticipated. "I am Henry Kincaid. Thomas Whitmore sent me to fetch you. He is dealing with some trouble at his ranch and asked me to see you settled at the hotel until he can come to town." Zelda felt her stomach sink. She had expected her intended to meet her, had prepared herself for that first awkward meeting, and now she was being shuffled off like an inconvenient package. "I see. How long will that be?" Henry's expression shifted, something like sympathy crossing his features. "Hard to say, miss. Could be a day, could be a few. He has some issues with his cattle that need sorting." He reached for her trunk, lifting it with an ease that suggested considerable strength. "The hotel is just down the street. It is not fancy, but it is clean, and the proprietor is honest." She followed him, acutely aware of the eyes tracking them down the main street. Henry walked with a relaxed confidence, nodding to people they passed, and she noticed that most returned his greeting with genuine friendliness. Whatever his station in this town, he was clearly well regarded. They reached a 2-story building with a sign that read, "El Dorado Hotel," and he held the door open for her, gesturing for her to enter first. The interior was dim and cooler than the street, with a long desk to one side and a narrow staircase leading up to the second floor. A woman in her 50s stood behind the desk, her sharp eyes taking in Zelda's expensive traveling dress and the careful way she held herself. "This is Mrs. Patterson," Henry said. "She runs the hotel. Mrs. Patterson, this is Miss Danvers, Thomas Whitmore's intended." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Welcome to El Dorado, Miss Danvers. I have a room ready for you, second floor, overlooks the street. It is quiet this time of day." Henry set her trunk down beside the desk. "I will leave you to get settled. If you need anything, I work at the livery stable at the end of town. Just ask anyone, and they can point you in the right direction." Zelda found herself nodding, though a part of her wanted to ask him to stay, to explain more about Thomas Whitmore and what she was walking into. But that would be improper, and she had already caused enough scandal in her life. "Thank you, Mr. Kincaid. I appreciate your assistance." Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion she could not quite read, and then he tipped his hat to her. "Welcome to El Dorado, Miss Danvers. I hope you find it to your liking." With that, he turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind him. Mrs. Patterson showed her to her room, a simple space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that did indeed overlook the main street. Once she was alone, Zelda sank onto the bed, suddenly exhausted. The journey had been long and uncomfortable, but it was more than physical fatigue that weighed on her now. She was alone in a strange place, about to marry a man she did not know, and the only person who had shown her any kindness was a stranger who worked in a stable. She rose and moved to the window, looking out at the dusty street below. El Dorado was not a large town, perhaps a few hundred people at most, and it had the ramshackle, temporary feel of a place still finding its footing. She could see the livery stable Henry had mentioned at the far end of the street, a large barn-like structure with a corral attached. As she watched, a figure emerged from the building, and even at this distance, she recognized Henry's distinctive walk. He paused to speak with someone, his posture relaxed and open, and then disappeared around the side of the building. The next 2 days passed in a strange limbo. Thomas Whitmore did not come to town, and Zelda found herself confined to the hotel, unsure of what she was supposed to do. Mrs. Patterson was kind enough, bringing her meals and making conversation, but the older woman was busy with the running of the hotel and could not spend much time with her. On the afternoon of the second day, restlessness drove Zelda out of her room and down to the street. She had spent her whole life in cities, surrounded by people and activity, and the enforced idleness was making her feel trapped. She walked slowly down the wooden sidewalk, her parasol raised against the harsh sun. The town was busier than it had been when she arrived, with wagons and horses moving up and down the street and people going about their business. She passed a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with its doors propped open to let in air, and finally reached the livery stable. She had not intended to come here, but her feet seemed to have carried her of their own accord. The large doors were open, and she could hear the sounds of horses inside, the stamping of hooves and the occasional whinny. She hesitated at the entrance, unsure if she should go in, when Henry appeared, leading a large bay horse. He stopped when he saw her, surprise evident on his face. "Miss Danvers, are you looking for something?" "I was just walking," she said, feeling foolish. "I have been cooped up in that hotel room and I needed some air." He nodded, tying the horse to a post. "I can understand that. It is a long journey from Philadelphia and then to be stuck waiting." He gestured to the interior of the stable. "Would you like to see the horses? I have some fine animals here." She should have said no, should have returned to the hotel and waited for Thomas Whitmore like a proper lady. But the warmth in Henry's voice and the genuine invitation in his eyes made her nod before she could think better of it. "I would like that, thank you." The stable was dim and smelled of hay and leather and horses, a combination that was oddly pleasant. Henry led her down the central aisle, pointing out different animals and telling her about them. He spoke with an easy knowledge, clearly comfortable with the creatures, and she found herself relaxing in his presence. There was something about him that put her at ease, a gentle manner that contrasted sharply with the rough exterior of the town. "This is Dancer," he said, stopping at a stall that held a beautiful chestnut mare. "She belongs to the doctor's wife, but she is getting older and does not ride as much anymore. Dancer gets restless if she does not get enough exercise." Zelda reached out tentatively and the mare lowered her head, allowing her to stroke the soft nose. "She is beautiful. Do you ride, Mr. Kincaid?" "Every day," he said. "It is part of my work, exercising the horses that do not get ridden often enough. And please call me Henry. We are not so formal out here." "Then you must call me Zelda," she said, surprising herself. But it felt right somehow in this place where the rules of Philadelphia society seemed very far away. They spent nearly an hour in the stable, and Zelda felt more alive than she had in weeks. Henry told her about the town, about the people who lived here and the challenges they faced, and she found herself fascinated by his stories. He spoke of droughts and floods, of cattle drives and conflicts with neighboring ranchers, painting a picture of a life that was hard but also filled with a kind of freedom she had never experienced. When she finally reluctantly said she should return to the hotel, he walked with her, carrying the conversation easily until they reached Mrs. Patterson's establishment. "Thank you for this afternoon," she said, meaning it. "I had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply enjoy something." His eyes met hers and she saw something shift in their depths. "You are welcome, Zelda. If you need anything or if you just want to talk, you know where to find me." She watched him walk away, a strange ache in her chest that she could not quite name. This was not supposed to happen. She was here to marry Thomas Whitmore, to start a new life with a man she barely knew, and she could not afford to develop feelings for someone else. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, she could not stop thinking about the way Henry had looked at her, with a kindness and attention that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. That evening, as she sat by her window watching the sun set over the dusty plains, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Patterson standing there, her expression troubled. "Miss Danvers, I have a message from Mr. Whitmore. He says he cannot come to town for at least another 3 days. There has been some trouble with rustlers, and he needs to deal with it." Zelda felt a complicated mixture of disappointment and relief. "I understand. Thank you for letting me know." The older woman hesitated. "If you need anything, or if you want some company, you just let me know. I know this is not easy for you, coming all this way and then having to wait." "You are very kind," Zelda said, and she meant it. Everyone in this town seemed kinder than she had expected, from Mrs. Patterson to Henry Kincaid. Perhaps the West was not as harsh as she had feared. The next morning, she decided to explore more of the town. She could not simply sit in her room for another 3 days, and she needed to start learning about the place that would be her home. She put on her simplest dress, though even that was far fancier than what the other women in town wore, and ventured out. The general store was her first stop, a large building filled with everything from fabric to tools to preserved foods. The proprietor, a man named Mr. Jenkins, greeted her warmly and seemed genuinely pleased to have her business. As she was examining some fabric, a woman about her age approached, her curious expression friendly. "You must be Miss Danvers. I am Sarah Mitchell. My husband owns the feed store next door." Zelda smiled, grateful for the overture. "It is nice to meet you, Mrs. Mitchell." "Oh, please call me Sarah. We heard you were coming to marry Thomas Whitmore. That must be quite an adventure, coming all the way from Philadelphia." They talked for a while, and Sarah invited her to a quilting circle that met twice a week at the church. Zelda accepted, pleased to have something to fill her time and a chance to meet more of the women in town. As she left the general store, she felt lighter than she had since arriving. Perhaps she could build a life here after all. She was walking back toward the hotel when she saw Henry again, this time loading supplies into a wagon outside the livery stable. He saw her and raised a hand in greeting, and without thinking, she altered her path to speak with him. "Good morning, Henry." "Morning, Zelda." He set down the bag of feed he was holding. "How are you finding El Dorado?" "Better than I expected," she admitted. "I met a woman named Sarah Mitchell this morning. She invited me to a quilting circle." "Sarah is good people," Henry said. "Her husband John is one of the most honest men I know. You will be in good company there." They talked for a few more minutes, and then Henry said, "I have to make a delivery out to one of the ranches this afternoon. If you would like, you could come along. It would give you a chance to see more of the countryside." She knew she should say no. It would not be proper to go riding alone with a man who was not her intended, especially in a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. But the prospect of spending more time with Henry, of seeing something beyond the confines of the town, was too tempting to resist. "I would like that very much." "I will pick you up at the hotel in an hour," he said, his smile reaching his eyes in a way that made her heart skip. True to his word, Henry arrived an hour later with a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. He helped her up onto the seat, his hand warm and steady on hers, and then climbed up beside her. As they rolled out of town, Zelda felt a sense of freedom she had not experienced in years. The prairie stretched out around them, vast and empty, the grass rippling in the wind like waves on an ocean. The sky was impossibly blue, unmarred by the smoke and haze of the city, and the air smelled of dust and wild things. Henry drove with easy competence, the reins loose in his hands, and he pointed out landmarks as they went. "That is the Mitchell Ranch over there," he said, gesturing to a cluster of buildings in the distance. "John runs about 200 head of cattle. And over that way is where the Anderson family has their homestead. They have been here longer than just about anyone." "How long have you been in El Dorado?" Zelda asked, genuinely curious. 5 years, he said. "I came out from Missouri after the war. I was looking for something different, I suppose, and I found it here." "Do you like it?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. "I do. It is hard work and the life is not easy, but there is a satisfaction in it that I never found back east. You build something here with your own hands, and you know it is yours because you earned it." She thought about that as they continued on, the wagon creaking beneath them. In Philadelphia, everything had been about appearances and connections, about who you knew and what your family name could buy you. Out here, it seemed, things were simpler and more honest. She liked that, even if it frightened her a little. The ranch they were delivering to was about an hour from town, a modest spread with a small house and a large barn. A man and woman came out to greet them, and Henry introduced them as the Carters. They were friendly and welcoming, insisting that Zelda come inside for some water while Henry unloaded the supplies. The house was simple but clean, with handmade curtains at the windows and a quilt on the back of a rocking chair. "Mrs. Carter chatted easily as she poured water from a pitcher, asking Zelda about her journey and her plans. When they were back in the wagon and heading toward town, Zelda found herself telling Henry about her life in Philadelphia, about the scandal that had driven her west, and the expectations that had always weighed on her. She had not intended to share so much, But there was something about Henry's quiet presence that made her feel safe, that made her want to open up in a way she rarely did. "That must have been difficult," he said when she finished. "Being judged for something that was not your fault." "It was," she admitted. "But perhaps it was also a blessing in disguise. I would never have come here otherwise, and for all that I was dreading it, I find that I am starting to like this place." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I am glad to hear that. El Dorado can be a good home, if you give it a chance." They returned to town as the sun was beginning to set, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink that took Zelda's breath away. Henry helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary, and she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the weather. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "I cannot remember the last time I enjoyed myself so much." "The pleasure was mine," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. That night, lying in her narrow hotel bed, Zelda could not stop thinking about Henry Kincaid. She was supposed to be preparing herself to marry Thomas Whitmore, to become his wife and build a life with him, but all she could think about was the way Henry had looked at her, the kindness in his eyes and the warmth in his voice. It was dangerous, these feelings that were growing inside her, and she knew she needed to stop them before they went any further. But knowing that and being able to do it were two very different things. The next day, Thomas Whitmore finally arrived in town. Zelda was having lunch at the hotel when Mrs. Patterson came to tell her that her intended was downstairs waiting for her. She took a moment to compose herself, smoothing her dress and checking her hair in the small mirror, and then descended the stairs. Thomas Whitmore was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, with a florid face and small, cold eyes. He stood in the hotel lobby with his hat in his hands, his gaze assessing as she approached. "Miss Danvers," he said, his voice rough. "You are more attractive than your photograph suggested." It was not the greeting she had hoped for, but she forced a smile. "Mr. Whitmore, it is a pleasure to finally meet you," he grunted. "I apologize for the delay. I have been dealing with some trouble on my ranch. Rustlers have been hitting the herds in this area, and I lost nearly 50 head last week." "That sounds very difficult," Zelda said, unsure what else to say. "It is the price of doing business out here," he said. "But I did not come to talk about cattle. I came to discuss our wedding. I have made arrangements with the minister for 3 days from now. That should give you enough time to prepare. 3 days." She felt her stomach clench. "That is very soon." "I see no reason to wait," he said. "You came here to marry me, and I have a ranch to run. The sooner we get this done, the sooner you can start settling into your new life." There was no warmth in his words, no suggestion that he was pleased to see her or interested in getting to know her. He spoke of their marriage as if it were a business transaction, something to be completed and checked off a list. Zelda felt a sinking sensation in her chest, but she nodded. "Of course, 3 days will be fine." He left shortly after, saying he had business to attend to in town before returning to his ranch. Zelda watched him go, feeling a sense of dread settle over her like a heavy cloak. This was the man she was going to marry, the man she would spend the rest of her life with, and she felt nothing for him but a vague anxiety. She thought of Henry, of the way he had looked at her, and the kindness he had shown, and she wanted to weep. That afternoon, unable to bear the confines of her room, she walked to the livery stable. Henry was there, as she had known he would be, working on repairing a bridle. He looked up when she entered, and his smile faded when he saw her expression. "Zelda, what is wrong?" "Thomas Whitmore came to town," she said, her voice flat. "We are to be married in 3 days." Something flashed across Henry's face, an emotion she could not quite name, and then it was gone, replaced by a carefully neutral expression. That is good news, I suppose. You have been waiting long enough. Yes, she said, though the word felt like ash in her mouth. Good news. They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them, and then Henry set down the bridle. Zelda, I need to tell you something. I should have said it sooner, but I did not think I had the right. Her heart began to pound. What is it? He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. I have feelings for you. I know that is improper, and I know you are promised to another man, but I could not let you marry him without you knowing how I feel. These past few days, getting to know you, have been some of the best of my life. You are kind and intelligent and brave, and I cannot stand the thought of you marrying a man who does not appreciate those things. Zelda felt tears prick her eyes. Henry, I have feelings for you too, but I made a promise. I came here to marry Thomas Whitmore, and I cannot go back on that. My reputation is already ruined. If I break this engagement as well, I will have nothing left. You would have me, he said quietly. I do not have much, just the livery stable and a small house on the edge of town, but I would do everything in my power to make you happy. You would not have to marry a man you do not love out of obligation. She wanted to say yes, wanted to throw caution to the wind and choose her own happiness for once in her life. But fear held her back, fear of the unknown and fear of what people would say. I cannot, she whispered. I am sorry, Henry, but I cannot. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded, his expression resigned. I understand. I will not ask again. But if you ever change your mind, if you ever need anything, I will be here. She fled then, unable to bear the pain in his eyes and the ache in her own chest. She returned to the hotel and went straight to her room, where she finally allowed herself to cry. She cried for the life she had lost in Philadelphia, for the choices that had been taken from her, and for the love she was walking away from because she was too afraid to reach for it. The next 2 days passed in a blur. Sarah Mitchell took her to meet the other women in town, and they helped her prepare for the wedding. They were kind and welcoming, but Zelda felt like she was moving through a dream, going through the motions without really being present. She saw Henry once, from a distance, and the look on his face when their eyes met nearly broke her. But she forced herself to look away, to focus on the future she had chosen. On the morning of her wedding, Mrs. Patterson helped her dress in the simple white gown she had brought from Philadelphia. It was beautiful, made of fine lace and silk, and it hung on her like a shroud. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the pale, hollow-eyed woman staring back at her. This was not how a bride should look on her wedding day, but she could not seem to summon any joy or excitement. The ceremony was held at the small church on the edge of town, with most of the townspeople in attendance. Thomas Whitmore stood at the altar in his best suit, looking impatient as she walked down the aisle on the arm of Mr. Jenkins, the general store owner who had agreed to give her away. She kept her eyes fixed on the minister, not trusting herself to look at the faces in the crowd. She did not want to see Henry, did not want to see the pain she knew would be there. The minister began the ceremony, his voice droning on about duty and commitment and the sanctity of marriage. Zelda heard the words as if from a great distance, her mind numb and her heart heavy. When he asked if anyone had reason why this couple should not be wed, the silence that followed felt like it stretched on forever. And then, just as the minister was about to continue, a voice rang out from the back of the church. I object. Every head turned, and Zelda felt her heart stop. Henry stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands and his expression determined. Thomas Whitmore's face turned red with anger. What is the meaning of this, Kincaid? Henry walked down the aisle, his eyes never leaving Zelda's face. The meaning is that this woman deserves better than to marry a man who sees her as nothing more than a convenience. I know I have no right to interfere, and I know I am probably ruining any chance I have of staying in this town, but I cannot stand by and watch this happen." Thomas took a step forward, his fists clenched. "You have some nerve, Kincaid. This is none of your business." "You are right. It is not," Henry said, his voice calm despite the tension crackling in the air. "But I am making it my business because I care about Zelda, and I think she deserves to know that she has a choice. She does not have to marry you. She can choose a different life, one where she is valued and loved for who she is, not what she can provide." The church erupted in whispers, and Zelda felt her cheeks burn. But through the embarrassment and the shock, she felt something else rising inside her, something that felt like hope. Henry was here, risking everything for her, and she knew in that moment that she could not marry Thomas Whitmore. She could not condemn herself to a loveless marriage when true love was standing right in front of her. She turned to Thomas, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I am sorry, Mr. Whitmore. Henry is right. I cannot marry you. It would not be fair to either of us." Thomas's face turned an alarming shade of purple. "You are making a mistake, Miss Danvers. I am offering you security and a good life. What can he offer you? He is nothing but a stable hand." "He offers me kindness," Zelda said, her voice growing stronger. "He offers me respect and tenderness and the chance to be truly happy. That is worth more to me than all the security in the world." She turned to Henry, and the look on his face made her breath catch. She walked toward him, leaving Thomas sputtering at the altar, and when she reached Henry, he took her hands in his. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, "because there is no going back from this." "I have never been more sure of anything," she said, and she meant it. The scandal of that day rippled through El Dorado for weeks, but Zelda found she did not care. She moved out of the hotel and into a small room above the general store that Mrs. Jenkins rented to her at a discounted rate. Henry courted her properly, with flowers and long walks and conversations that lasted late into the night. They talked about everything, their hopes and fears and dreams for the future, and with each passing day, Zelda fell more deeply in love with him. Thomas Whitmore tried to cause trouble for a while, spreading rumors about Zelda and Henry and threatening to run them out of town, but the people of El Dorado rallied around them. They had seen the way Thomas had treated his intended, and they had seen the genuine love between Henry and Zelda. Public opinion turned against Thomas, and eventually he gave up and focused his energy on his ranch. 3 months after that disastrous wedding day, Henry and Zelda were married in the same church, but this time the ceremony was filled with joy and laughter. Zelda wore the same white gown, but it looked different now, radiant instead of funereal. Henry stood at the altar with tears in his eyes as she walked toward him, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, he kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar. They moved into Henry's small house on the edge of town, a simple 2-room structure that Zelda immediately set about making into a home. She sewed curtains for the windows and planted a garden out back, and Henry built her a bookshelf to hold the volumes she had brought from Philadelphia. They were not wealthy, but they were happy in a way that Zelda had never imagined possible. Life in El Dorado was not easy. The work was hard and the conditions were often harsh, but Zelda found a satisfaction in it that she had never experienced in her old life. She joined the quilting circle and became friends with Sarah Mitchell and the other women in town. She helped Henry at the livery stable, learning to care for the horses and manage the business side of things. Together, they built a life that was uniquely theirs, shaped by their shared dreams and sustained by their love for each other. In the spring of 1874, Zelda discovered she was pregnant. Henry was overjoyed, though his excitement was tempered by worry. Medical care on the frontier was limited, and childbirth was dangerous even in the best circumstances. But Zelda refused to let fear overshadow her happiness. She had never thought she would be a mother, had assumed that her ruined reputation would mean a life of spinsterhood, and now she was carrying the child of a man she loved more than life itself. The pregnancy was difficult. The heat of the summer was oppressive, and Zelda struggled with constant nausea and fatigue. Henry was endlessly patient, fetching water and rubbing her swollen feet and holding her when she cried from the discomfort. He closed the livery stable early every day to be with her, and he never complained about the extra work her condition created. His tenderness during those months made her love him even more, if that was possible. In late October, as the prairie grass turned gold and the air took on a crisp edge, Zelda went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth, lasting through the night and into the next day. The doctor was called, and Sarah Mitchell stayed by her side, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with cool cloths. Henry paced outside the bedroom, his face drawn with worry, and when the baby finally arrived, a healthy boy with a strong set of lungs, he wept with relief. They named him James, after Henry's father, and he became the center of their world. Zelda had never known love could be so fierce and all-consuming as what she felt for her son. She would sit for hours watching him sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and the way his face scrunched up when he dreamed. Henry was an attentive father, often carrying James in a sling while he worked at the stable, and the sight of her tall, strong husband cradling their small son never failed to make Zelda's heart swell. The years that followed were filled with the ordinary joys and struggles of life on the frontier. The livery stable prospered under Henry and Zelda's joint management, and they were able to expand, buying the lot next door and building a larger facility. Henry's reputation for fair dealing and quality care spread throughout the region, and ranchers came from miles around to board their horses or purchase tack from his store. In 1876, Zelda gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace. She was a calm, sweet-tempered baby, the opposite of her boisterous older brother, and she quickly became Henry's favorite, though he would never admit it. James adored his little sister, and Zelda often found him sneaking into the nursery to check on her or bringing her wildflowers he had picked from the prairie. El Dorado continued to grow, transforming from a rough frontier town into a more established community. A proper school was built, and a railroad spur was added, connecting them to the main line and bringing new opportunities for trade. The changes were not always easy, and there were those who mourned the passing of the old ways, but Zelda found herself embracing the progress. She had come to love this place and these people, and she wanted to see them thrive. In the summer of 1878, when James was 3 and Grace was 2, disaster struck. A fire broke out in the livery stable in the middle of the night, likely caused by a lantern that had not been properly extinguished. Henry woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses screaming in terror. He ran for the stable, shouting for Zelda to get the children to safety, and she watched in horror as he disappeared into the burning building. The entire town turned out to fight the fire, forming bucket brigades and doing everything they could to contain the blaze. Henry emerged from the stable leading horse after horse, his face black with soot and his clothes singed, going back again and again until every animal was safe. By the time the fire was finally extinguished, the stable was a total loss, nothing but charred timbers and ash. Henry collapsed on the ground, coughing and exhausted, and Zelda fell to her knees beside him, checking him for injuries and thanking God that he was alive. The loss was devastating. Everything they had built was gone, and they had no money to rebuild. Zelda felt despair threatening to overwhelm her, but Henry refused to give in. "We will start over," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "We did it once and we can do it again." The town rallied around them in a way that left Zelda speechless. The ranchers whose horses Henry had saved donated lumber and labor. The women organized a fundraiser, selling quilts and baked goods, and raising enough money to help with the rebuilding. Even Thomas Whitmore, who had maintained a frosty distance since the failed wedding, contributed a generous sum. "I may not like you, Kincaid," he said gruffly when he dropped off the money, "but you are a good man and this town needs you." It took 6 months, but they rebuilt the livery stable bigger and better than before. Henry designed it with safety in mind, with multiple exits and better ventilation, and strict rules about lanterns and open flames. When they reopened for business, there was a celebration that lasted all day, with food and music and dancing in the street. Zelda held Grace in her arms and watched James dance with Sarah Mitchell's daughter, and she felt a profound gratitude for this community that had become her family. The years continued to roll by, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. James grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses almost as much as his father did. He spent every spare moment at the stable, learning how to care for the animals and helping with the daily tasks. Grace was quieter, more given to reading and drawing, but she had a fierce determination that reminded Zelda of herself. In 1880, they welcomed their third child, another son they named William. He was a surprise, as Zelda had thought her childbearing days were behind her, but he was a welcome one. Life was good, better than Zelda had ever dreamed possible. She had a husband who loved her, children who filled her days with joy and chaos, and a place in a community that valued her. The harsh frontier she had expected when she left Philadelphia had revealed itself to be a place of unexpected beauty and deep human connection. Yes, the work was hard and the conditions were often difficult, but there was a richness to this life that she had never found in the drawing rooms and ballrooms of her youth. In the spring of 1882, Zelda received a letter from her sister, the first communication she had had with her family in nearly 10 years. Her parents had both passed away, her sister wrote, and she was reaching out to try to mend the breach between them. The letter was full of apologies and regrets, and it asked if Zelda could find it in her heart to forgive. Zelda read the letter multiple times, her emotions warring between old hurts and a desire for reconciliation. In the end, she wrote back, not offering forgiveness exactly, but opening the door to the possibility of it. Some wounds took time to heal, but she had learned that holding on to anger only poisoned your own happiness. As the decade progressed, El Dorado continued to change. The town got its first telephone line in 1885, a source of wonder and skepticism in equal measure. James, now 10 years old, was fascinated by the technology and spent hours at the telegraph office, learning Morse code and pestering the operator with questions. Grace, at 8, had discovered a love of music and was taking piano lessons from the minister's wife. William, still a toddler, was a whirlwind of energy who kept Zelda constantly on her toes. Henry's hair had begun to show threads of gray, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there when they met, but to Zelda, he was as handsome as ever. They had weathered hardships and celebrated triumphs together, and their love had only deepened with time. She still remembered the day she had arrived in El Dorado, expecting harshness and finding instead a man who had shown her a tenderness she had never known. That tenderness had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, woven into the fabric of their daily lives in 1,000 small gestures and quiet moments. In 1887, a traveling photographer came through town, and Zelda insisted they have a family portrait made. They dressed in their best clothes and gathered in front of the stable, Henry and Zelda seated with William on Zelda's lap, and James and Grace standing behind them. The photographer fussed with his equipment and then told them to hold still. The moment felt suspended in time. This family she had built against all odds, and when the photograph was finally developed, Zelda framed it and hung it in a place of honor in their home. James turned 15 in 1889 and announced his intention to become a veterinarian. It would mean sending him away to school, something that filled Zelda with both pride and sorrow. She had always known her children would grow up and forge their own paths, but the reality of it was harder than she had anticipated. Henry was supportive, setting aside money from the stable's profits to pay for James's education, and they began making plans for him to attend a veterinary college in Kansas City the following year. Grace, at 13, was beginning to show signs of the woman she would become. She was tall for her age, with Zelda's dark hair and Henry's gray-blue eyes, and she had a sharp intelligence that sometimes intimidated the boys her age. She talked about becoming a teacher, about traveling to other parts of the country, and seeing all the places she had read about in her books. Zelda encouraged her, even as she worried about what the world would hold for a young woman with such ambitions. William, now 7, remained the baby of the family, though he hated being called that. He was fearless in a way that gave Zelda heart palpitations, climbing trees that were too tall and riding horses that were too spirited. Henry said he reminded him of himself at that age, and he spent hours teaching William about the stable and the land, passing on the knowledge that had been passed to him. In the summer of 1890, El Dorado celebrated its 25th anniversary as an incorporated town. There was a week of festivities, including horse races, a pie-eating contest, and a dance that lasted until dawn. Henry and Zelda attended the dance, leaving the children in Sarah Mitchell's care. And for one night, they were young again, spinning around the floor to the music of the fiddles and laughing like they had when they first fell in love. Henry pulled her close as they danced, his hand warm on her waist, and whispered in her ear, "I would do it all again, every bit of it, just to end up here with you." Tears pricked Zelda's eyes. "So would I," she whispered back. "So would I." The next year brought change again when James left for veterinary school. Zelda cried as the train pulled out of the station, Henry's arm around her shoulders the only thing keeping her upright. The house felt too quiet without James's boisterous presence, and she found herself wandering into his empty room, touching his things and wondering how the years had passed so quickly. But James wrote often, his letters filled with excitement about his studies and the new world he was discovering, and his happiness eased some of the ache of his absence. Grace threw herself into her studies with renewed vigor, determined to follow in her brother's footsteps and leave El Dorado to pursue her own education. Zelda and Henry had long discussions about whether they should allow it, whether it was safe or proper for a young woman to go off on her own. But in the end, they decided that they could not clip her wings out of fear. They had raised her to be strong and independent, and they had to trust that she would carry those lessons with her wherever she went. In 1893, the country was hit by an economic depression that affected even small towns like El Dorado. Business at the livery stable slowed as people tightened their belts and made do with less. Henry took on extra work, hiring himself out to ranches that needed help with breaking horses or repairing fences, and Zelda started a small business making and selling preserves and baked goods. It was a lean time, but they had weathered storms before, and they knew they would make it through this one as well. William, now 10, took on more responsibilities at the stable, proving himself to be a capable and hard-working boy. He did not have James's passion for horses or Grace's intellectual curiosity, but he had a steady reliability that Henry valued. "He will make a good partner someday," Henry told Zelda one evening as they watched William carefully curry a mare. "He has the temperament for it." Zelda agreed. Each of her children had turned out so differently, but she loved them all fiercely. They were her legacy, the proof that she had made the right choice all those years ago when she walked away from that altar and toward Henry. James returned home in 1895 with his degree, ready to set up practice in El Dorado. The town was thrilled to have its own veterinarian, and James quickly became indispensable, tending to everything from prize cattle to beloved family pets. He was 20 years old now, a man grown, and Zelda could hardly believe that this confident young professional was the same baby she had held in her arms 2 decades earlier. He built a small office next to the livery stable, and father and son worked side by side, a partnership that brought Henry immense pride. That same year, Grace graduated from the El Dorado school at the top of her class. She had been accepted to a women's college in Massachusetts, a prestigious institution that would prepare her to be a teacher. Zelda helped her pack, folding dresses and petticoats and giving her all the advice she could think of. "Be careful," she said, "but also be brave. You have so much potential, Grace. Do not let anyone tell you that you cannot do something simply because you are a woman." Grace hugged her tightly. "I learned that from you, Mama. You left everything you knew to come out here and you built a life on your own terms. I want to do the same." Watching Grace board the train was even harder than it had been with James. Grace was her only daughter, and they had always been close. But Zelda forced herself to smile and wave as the train pulled away, carrying her daughter toward a future that was bright with possibility. With both older children gone, the house felt emptier than ever. William tried to fill the void, spending more time with his parents and talking more than he ever had before, and Zelda appreciated his efforts. Henry, too, seemed to feel the absence keenly, though he said little about it. They were entering a new phase of their lives, one where their children were becoming independent adults, and it required adjustment. The turn of the century came, and with it, more changes. El Dorado now had electric lights on the main street, and there was talk of paving the roads. The frontier town Zelda had arrived in 26 years earlier was becoming a modern community, connected to the wider world by railroad and telegraph and telephone. Some of the old-timers grumbled about progress, but Zelda found herself excited by it. She had never been one to cling to the past, and she looked forward to seeing what the new century would bring. In 1901, James married a young woman named Emma, the daughter of a rancher from a neighboring town. The wedding was a joyous affair, held at the church with half the town in attendance. Zelda watched her son pledge his love to his bride, and she thought back to her own wedding to Henry, to the joy and certainty she had felt that day. James and Emma were clearly deeply in love, and she had no doubt they would build a good life together. Grace returned home for the wedding, looking polished and sophisticated after her years in the East. She had changed, grown more confident and worldly, but she was still the same Grace underneath. She had taken a teaching position in Boston and talked enthusiastically about her students and her work. Zelda was proud beyond measure, though she missed having her daughter close by. William, now 18, had taken over much of the day-to-day running of the livery stable, allowing Henry to step back a bit. Henry was 53 now, his hair more gray than brown, and the years of hard work had taken a toll on his body. He moved a bit slower than he used to, and sometimes Zelda caught him rubbing his lower back when he thought no one was looking. But he was still strong and still the kind, tender man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. In the spring of 1902, Zelda celebrated her 49th birthday. It seemed impossible that so many years had passed, that she was no longer the frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in El Dorado expecting harshness, and finding instead a love that had transformed her life. She and Henry took a rare day away from work, packing a picnic and riding out to a spot on the prairie that had always been special to them. They sat on a blanket under the vast Kansas sky, eating sandwiches and remembering all the years they had shared. "You ever regret it?" Henry asked, his hand finding hers. "Staying here, choosing this life?" Zelda looked at him, at the face she knew better than her own, and shook her head. "Not for a single moment. You gave me something I never thought I would have, Henry. You gave me love and family and a place to belong." "How could I ever regret that?" He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You gave me the same, Zelda. You took a chance on me when you had every reason not to, and you made my life richer than I ever imagined possible." They sat there for a long time, holding hands and watching the grass ripple in the wind. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and beautiful, and Zelda felt a deep contentment settle over her. This was her home, these were her people, and this was the life she had chosen. It had not always been easy, but it had been good, so much better than she had dared to hope. In 1903, James and Emma had their first child, a boy they named Henry after his grandfather. Zelda held her grandson for the first time and felt a surge of love so powerful it took her breath away. She was a grandmother now, another milestone in a life full of them, and she marveled at the way life kept unfolding, kept bringing new joys and new challenges. Grace came home for an extended visit that summer, and it was the first time in years that all three of their children were under the same roof. They had a family dinner that lasted hours, with everyone talking over each other and sharing stories and laughing until their sides hurt. Zelda looked around the table at her family, at the adults her children had become and the grandchild who represented the future, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. After dinner, Grace pulled her aside. "Mama, I need to tell you something. I have been offered a position as head mistress at a girls' school in New York. It is an incredible opportunity, but it would mean staying in the East permanently." Zelda felt her heart squeeze, but she forced a smile. "That is wonderful, Grace. You should take it." "But it means I would not be coming home as often," Grace said, her eyes searching Zelda's face. "I do not want you to think I am abandoning you." Zelda took her daughter's hands. "I could never think that. You are living your life following your dreams, and that is exactly what I want for you. Your father and I are so proud of you, Grace. You have accomplished so much, and you are going to continue to do amazing things." They hugged tightly, and Zelda allowed herself a few tears. Letting go was hard, but it was also necessary. Her children had their own lives to live, and she would not hold them back out of her own need. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own mixture of joy and sorrow. In 1905, William married a local girl named Anna, and they moved into a small house on the other side of town. Unlike James, William had no desire to leave El Dorado, and he and Henry continued to run the livery stable together. Zelda was glad to have at least one of her children close by, though she missed the others terribly. Henry's health began to decline in his late 50s. He developed a persistent cough that winter would not go away, and by 1906, it was clear that his lungs had been damaged, likely from the fire all those years ago. The doctor said there was nothing to be done, that the scarring was too extensive, and that Henry needed to take it easy. But taking it easy had never been in Henry's nature, and he continued to work at the stable, refusing to let his condition slow him down. Zelda watched him with a fear that kept her awake at night. She could not imagine her life without Henry, could not fathom a world where he was not by her side. They had been together for more than 30 years, and he was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. She tried to get him to rest, to let William handle more of the work, but Henry was stubborn. "I am not ready to be put out to pasture yet," he would say, his eyes twinkling despite the weariness in his face. In the summer of 1908, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. Their children all came home for the occasion, even Grace, who took time off from her demanding position in New York. There was a party at the church, with food and music and speeches that made Zelda cry and laugh in equal measure. When it was Henry's turn to speak, he stood with difficulty, his breathing labored, and looked at Zelda with such love that everyone in the room felt it. "30 years ago," he said, his voice rough but strong, "I met a woman who changed my life. She was brave and beautiful and scared, and she had every reason to choose the safe path. But she chose me instead, and I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of that choice. Zelda, you are my heart, my home, my everything. I love you more today than I did on our wedding day, and I will love you until my last breath." There was not a dry eye in the room, and Zelda felt her throat close with emotion. She went to him, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he would never let go. That winter was hard. Henry's cough worsened, and he developed a fever that would not break. The doctor was called multiple times, and Zelda rarely left his side, sitting by his bed and holding his hand and praying to a God she was not sure was listening. James came home to help, bringing his medical knowledge and his presence, but there was little anyone could do. Henry's lungs were giving out, and they all knew it. On a cold night in January 1909, with Zelda holding one hand and William holding the other, Henry slipped away quietly. He was 60 years old, and he had lived a full life, but to Zelda, it felt like he was being taken far too soon. She sat by his bed long after he was gone, unable to let go, unable to accept that the man she had loved for more than 3 decades was truly gone. The funeral was held on a gray, overless day, and it seemed like the entire town turned out to pay their respects. Henry had been a pillar of the community, a man who had touched countless lives with his kindness and integrity, and the outpouring of love was overwhelming. Zelda stood at the graveside, flanked by her children and grandchildren, and listened to the minister speak about Henry's virtues and his legacy. But the words felt hollow. How could anyone sum up a life like Henry's in a few sentences? How could they capture the depth of his goodness, the tenderness he had shown her, the way he had made her feel cherished every single day? The weeks and months that followed were the hardest of Zelda's life. She moved through her days in a fog, going through the motions but feeling nothing. The house felt empty without Henry, the bed too large and too cold. She found herself talking to him sometimes, telling him about her day or asking his opinion on something, and then remembering with a sharp stab of pain that he was gone. Her children rallied around her, especially William and Anna, who insisted she come stay with them for a while. But Zelda eventually returned to her own home, to the space she and Henry had shared, because it was the only place she felt close to him. She spent hours going through his things, his clothes and tools and the small mementos he had collected over the years, and she wept for the loss of him. But slowly, gradually, the grief began to ease. It never went away, not completely, but it became something she could carry rather than something that crushed her. She thought about all the years they had had together, all the love they had shared, and she felt grateful rather than bitter. Henry had given her a gift, the gift of being truly seen and truly loved, and that was something no one could take from her. She threw herself into her grandchildren, finding joy in their laughter and their energy. James and Emma had 3 children now, and William and Anna had too, and Zelda delighted in spoiling them and telling them stories about their grandfather. She wanted them to know what a remarkable man he had been, wanted his legacy to live on through them. In 1912, Grace came home for an extended visit, and she and Zelda spent hours talking, really talking in a way they had not done in years. Grace had never married, had dedicated herself to her work and her students, and she was content with that choice. "I saw what you and Papa had," she told Zelda one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "And I knew I could not settle for anything less. If I could not have that kind of love, I would rather have my independence and my work." Zelda understood. She had been lucky to find that kind of love, but she knew it was rare. "You have built a good life, Grace. Your father would be so proud of you." "I hope so," Grace said softly. "I miss him, Mama, every day." "So do I," Zelda said, reaching over to take her daughter's hand. "So do I." The years rolled on, and Zelda settled into a quiet routine. She helped William at the livery stable, doing the bookkeeping and managing the business side of things. She attended church every Sunday and the quilting circle every week, maintaining the friendships she had built over the decades. She was now one of the oldest residents of El Dorado, one of the few who remembered the town in its earliest days, and people often came to her for stories about the past. In 1918, the world was gripped by a terrible war overseas, and El Dorado sent many of its young men to fight. Zelda volunteered with the Red Cross, knitting socks and rolling bandages and writing letters to soldiers who had no one else to write to. It kept her busy and gave her a sense of purpose, and she was grateful for the distraction. When the war finally ended, the town celebrated, but the joy was tempered by the losses they had suffered. Several of El Dorado's sons did not come home, and Zelda attended more funerals, standing with grieving mothers and offering what comfort she could. Life was so fragile, she thought, so easily lost. It made her treasure her own family all the more. In the 1920s, the world changed rapidly. Cars became more common, and El Dorado paved its streets and installed more electric lights. The livery stable, which had once been the center of the town's economy, began to decline as people switched from horses to automobiles. William diversified, adding a garage and learning to repair cars, and the business adapted and survived. Zelda was proud of him for having the foresight to change with the times, something Henry would have done as well. Her grandchildren grew up, and some of them gave her great-grandchildren, another generation to love and spoil. Zelda felt herself becoming a link in a chain that stretched back to the past and forward into the future, and she found comfort in that. She might be old now, her hair white and her movements slow, but her life had mattered. She had loved and been loved, had raised children who were good people, and had helped build a community that endured. In 1930, on a warm spring day, Zelda sat on her porch watching the town go by. She was 81 years old now, and her body was failing in the way bodies do when they have lived a long time. But her mind was still sharp, and her memories were vivid. She thought about the girl she had been when she arrived in El Dorado all those years ago, frightened and alone and expecting nothing but harshness. And she thought about the man who had shown her tenderness instead, who had loved her with a gentle strength that had sustained her through all the years since. "I hope you are waiting for me, Henry," she whispered to the wind. "I have so much to tell you." That night, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Zelda Kincaid closed her eyes for the last time. She went peacefully, a smile on her lips, and those who loved her said it looked like she was seeing someone she had missed for a very long time. She was buried beside Henry in the El Dorado cemetery, under a headstone that bore both their names and the inscription, "Together in life, together in eternity." And in the years that followed, their story became a legend in the town, a tale of love and courage that was passed down through the generations. The woman who had arrived expecting harshness and the cowboy who had shown her tenderness became symbols of what was best about the frontier spirit: resilience, kindness, and the belief that love could flourish even in the most unlikely places. The livery stable that Henry had built and Zelda had helped run eventually closed, replaced by a modern garage that bore the Kincaid name. But a photograph hung in the office, showing Henry and Zelda in their younger days, standing in front of the stable with their arms around each other. And anyone who asked about it would hear the story, told with pride and affection, of two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that lasted a lifetime. Their descendants spread across the country, carrying the Kincaid name and the values Henry and Zelda had instilled in them. Some became doctors, others teachers, still others ranchers and business owners. But they all knew where they came from, knew the story of their great-great-grandparents who had met in a dusty Kansas town and fallen in love in defiance of convention and expectation. And in El Dorado, which had grown from a rough frontier settlement into a thriving small city, the memory of Henry and Zelda Kincaid endured. The church where they had married still stood, and the cemetery where they were buried was well maintained, their graves always decorated with fresh flowers by family members and townspeople who wanted to honor their memory. They had become part of the town's history, woven into its identity, a reminder that even in the hardest times and the harshest places, love could bloom and endure. On warm summer evenings, when the wind blew across the Kansas prairie, and the sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink, some people swore they could see two figures walking hand in hand along the old roads on the edge of town. A tall man with a gentle face, and a woman with dark hair and a determined stride, forever young, forever together. And those who saw them smiled, knowing that some loves are strong enough to transcend even death, binding two souls together for all eternity. The story of Zelda and Henry Kincaid became more than just a local legend. It became a testament to the power of tenderness in a harsh world, to the courage it takes to choose love over security, and to the way two people can build something lasting and beautiful together. In a time and place that demanded toughness and self-reliance, they had shown that vulnerability and kindness were strengths, not weaknesses, and that a gentle heart could be as brave as any warrior's. Their great-grandchildren would gather on holidays and tell the story to the younger generation, embellishing it with details both real and imagined. They talked about how Zelda had walked away from her own wedding, scandalizing the entire town, and how Henry had stood up in that church and proclaimed his love in front of everyone. They described the fire that destroyed the livery stable and the way the community had rallied to help rebuild. They spoke of the tenderness with which Henry had treated Zelda, of the way he had seen her not as a burden or an obligation, but as a partner and an equal. And they talked about the lesson that was at the heart of the story. That love, real love, was not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations, though those had their place. It was about the daily choice to be kind, to be present, to cherish the person you had chosen to spend your life with. It was about building something together, brick by brick, day by day, until you looked back and realized you had created something beautiful and enduring. In the archives of the El Dorado Historical Society, there were documents that told the story in a more prosaic way. Marriage certificates and property deeds, birth and death records, newspaper clippings about the fire and the rebuilding of the livery stable. There were photographs, too, showing Henry and Zelda at different stages of their lives, their faces aging but their love evident in every image. In one particularly striking photograph, taken on their 25th anniversary, they stood in front of the rebuilt stable, their arms around each other, their expressions radiating contentment and deep affection. The Historical Society put together an exhibit about the early days of El Dorado, and Henry and Zelda's story featured prominently. Visitors from all over the state came to see it, drawn by the romance and the drama of their tale. A local author even wrote a book about them, a fictionalized account that stayed true to the essential facts while adding color and detail. The book became a modest bestseller, and suddenly people all over the country knew about the cowboy and the woman from Philadelphia who had found love on the Kansas frontier. But for those who had actually known Henry and Zelda, or who had heard the stories firsthand from their children and grandchildren, the truth was both simpler and more profound than any dramatized version could capture. They had been real people with flaws and fears, who had struggled and sometimes failed, who had faced hardships that had tested them to their limits. But through it all, they had held onto each other, had chosen love over and over again, and that choice had made all the difference. James Kincaid, their oldest son, lived to be 85 years old, passing away in 1954. Before he died, he recorded an oral history for the Historical Society, talking about his parents and his memories of growing up in El Dorado. His voice, preserved on crackling tape, spoke of a father who had been patient and kind, who had taught him about honor and integrity through example rather than lecture. And he spoke of a mother who had been strong and determined, who had adapted to a life that must have been so different from what she had known, and who had done it with grace and courage. "My father loved my mother with everything he had," James said in that recording. And she loved him the same way. They were partners in the truest sense, equals who respected and supported each other. That is what I learned from them. That is what I tried to build in my own marriage. And I think that is their real legacy, not the livery stable or the property they accumulated, but the example they set of what love should look like. Grace Kincaid never married, as she had told her mother, but she had a long and distinguished career in education, eventually becoming the superintendent of schools for a large district in New York. She retired in 1940 and moved back to El Dorado, spending her final years in the town where she had been born. She was a fixture at the Historical Society, giving talks about her parents and the early days of the town, and she was instrumental in preserving their legacy. When she died in 1962 at the age of 80, she was buried in the family plot next to her parents and brothers, her gravestone noting her accomplishments, but also her identity as the daughter of Henry and Zelda Kincaid. William Kincaid, the youngest of the three children, took over the family business and ran it until his death in 1968. He and his wife Anna had 5 children, who spread across the country, but maintained close ties to El Dorado. The business eventually closed in the 1970s, a victim of changing times and changing technology, but the building was preserved as a historical landmark, a reminder of the days when horses rather than cars filled the streets. By the turn of the 21st century, El Dorado had changed beyond recognition from the rough frontier town that Zelda had arrived in back in 1873. It was a modern community with paved streets and high-speed internet, shopping centers, and a community college. The wooden sidewalks and hitching posts were long gone, replaced by concrete and parking meters. But the church where Henry and Zelda had married still stood, carefully maintained and still holding services every Sunday. And the cemetery where they were buried had become a place of pilgrimage for romantics and history buffs alike, who came to see the graves and pay their respects to a love that had endured. On the 150th anniversary of Zelda's arrival in El Dorado, the town held a special celebration. Descendants of Henry and Zelda came from all over the country, gathering to honor their ancestors and share stories. There was a reenactment of the famous moment when Henry had stood up in the church and objected to Zelda's wedding to Thomas Whitmore, performed by local actors and watched by hundreds of people. There were speeches and a historical exhibit, and a dance that lasted long into the night, echoing the celebrations of generations past. And in the midst of all the festivities, an elderly woman stood quietly at Henry and Zelda's grave, tears streaming down her face. She was 93 years old, the great-great-granddaughter of Henry and Zelda, and she had grown up hearing stories about them. She had been named Zelda in honor of her ancestor, and she had always felt a special connection to the couple whose love story had shaped her family's history. As she stood there, she thought about her own life, about the love she had found and lost, and she felt grateful for the example her great-great-grandparents had set. "Thank you," she whispered, placing a single white rose on the grave. "Thank you for showing us what was possible." The sun was setting over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and for just a moment, the elderly woman could have sworn she saw two figures walking hand in hand across the cemetery, their forms translucent and glowing in the fading light. She blinked, and they were gone, but the sense of peace and love that had washed over her remained. Some things, she realized, were eternal. Some loves were strong enough to echo through the generations, inspiring and guiding those who came after. And so the story of Henry and Zelda Kincaid lived on, a testament to the power of tenderness in a world that often demanded toughness, to the courage it took to choose love over security, and to the way two people could build something beautiful and lasting together. They had arrived in El Dorado as strangers, she expecting harshness and he offering kindness, and they had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Their love had been the foundation on which a family was built, and that family had gone on to touch countless other lives, spreading the values of kindness and compassion and unwavering commitment that Henry and Zelda had embodied. In the end, that was the true measure of their lives, not in the property they had accumulated or the business they had built, but in the love they had shared and the example they had set. They had shown that even in the harshest of environments, tenderness could flourish. They had proven that love, real love, was not a weakness but a strength, capable of sustaining people through hardship and loss and the inevitable challenges of life. And they had demonstrated that the choices we make, the people we choose to love and the way we choose to love them, ripple out beyond our own lives, shaping the future in ways we can never fully anticipate. As the celebrations wound down and the descendants of Henry and Zelda Kincaid began to depart, heading back to their homes across the country, they carried with them renewed appreciation for their heritage and the story that had shaped their family. And in El Dorado, Kansas, the town that had been home to Henry and Zelda for more than 3 decades, life went on as it always had, but with the knowledge that something special had happened here, something worth remembering and honoring and passing down through the generations. The cowboy who had shown a frightened woman tenderness she had never felt, and the woman who had been brave enough to accept that tenderness and build a life around it, had become immortal in the way that matters most, through the love and memory of those who came after, and through the enduring power of their story to inspire and uplift anyone who heard it. They had lived and loved and built something beautiful together, and in doing so, they had left the world a little better than they had found it. That was their gift, their legacy, and their triumph. and it would endure as long as there were people who believed in the transformative power of love and the importance of choosing tenderness over harshness, compassion over indifference, and connection over isolation. Their story was a reminder that love, in the end, was what mattered most, and that a life lived in love was a life well lived, no matter the challenges or hardships that came along the way.